Thank you.
Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Eliminating Cash Options for Public Transit Fares, Costs, Benefits, and Equity Impacts. My name is Brendan Williams. I am the Research Program Administrator at Portland State University's Transportation, Research, and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC consortium members are the University of Oregon, University of Utah, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and Oregon Institute of Technology. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. Our presenter today is Dr. Aaron Golub. He is an associate professor and director of the School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University. His work focuses on the social equity impacts of current transportation planning practices on how people participate in planning and who wins and loses from transportation plans and investments. We hold monthly NITC webinars. The next one will be on June 8th at 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., presented by Kathy Liu from the University of Utah. It will be electric bus deployment, cost, and environmental equity. And on July 13th at 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific time, Diana Mason from the University of Oregon will present on the impact of ride-hail services on the accessibility of nonprofit services. Okay, a brief overview of this webinar. Aaron is going to present for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 minutes to answer your questions. During the presentation, please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A. Don't submit them during the chat. I'll remind you if you do. We just can't handle questions easily that way. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will be included in your post-webinar email. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron.
Thanks so much, Brendan, and the whole NITC team for setting up our great webinar series. And thanks to everyone for attending. Good morning on the West Coast and good afternoon on the East Coast and wherever you are on planet Earth. I'm excited to present actually our second webinar from this study. And if you're interested in the first part, and I'll describe what that covered briefly, that was from last May of 2020. So I'm going to share my screen now and go through some slides that I believe you can download from the, or maybe they are sent out later. Sorry, let me.
I have a link. I'm going to share it in the chat, Aaron.
Okay, thanks for that, Brennan. Okay, great. So I want to give you just a preview of what you're going to hear. This is not a study about the effect on operations of eliminating cash payment for transit in terms of speeding up boarding times and things like that. That is actually, there's a lot of research on that. What we're doing in this study is looking at the financial and cost of fare collection impacts of eliminating cash or using cash workarounds. And we do find that there's some interesting interactions between agency or property size and the number of riders and the number of people who are potentially excluded by eliminating cash payment options. and the costs of collecting that fare or implementing those workarounds. And so that's what you're going to hear about today. And there is other work on the impacts on fare collection and boarding times and efficiencies in that way, and we're not going to cover that today. First, I want to introduce my project team. So I'm Aaron Golub of School of Planning at Portland State University. Ann Brown is an assistant professor in the School of Planning, Public Policy and Management at the University of Oregon. Candace Brakewood, assistant professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And John MacArthur, research associate here at our Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. So this project was started by really asking the question, as public transit agencies and providers increasingly move to payment, reservation, travel information, and trip planning and last mile connectivity service systems which require travelers to have access to private internet, smartphone, and bank and credit services, how do we ensure universal access to those new innovations? And for this presentation, what are the costs and benefits of those steps taken to ensure access? This project was funded by a consortium of folks interested in this issue: the city of Eugene, Oregon, the city of Gresham, Oregon, Lane Transit District, which is the transit provider for Eugene, Oregon, a Clever Consulting Group out of Portland, Oregon, RTD Denver, and as well as our research center, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities at Portland State University. So some motivation here. Payment technologies are rapidly evolving, and they're kind of what we're calling automating. So they're integrating credit, smartphone, internet, and other distributed information systems. And many agencies are planning to adopt these technologies over the coming decade, possibly completely eliminating cash collection for transit fare payment. These will likely smooth operations, improve convenience and data collection and planning for many agencies and for most riders. But what about those few riders that cannot adapt to these new payment technologies? And that's what motivates the study. So one thing I do want to cover, many of you perhaps have followed this study or attended last year's webinar or are already interested in these disparities. I'm assuming most of you maybe know a little bit about this idea of digital divide, but I want to quickly run through a few points on disparities in access to digital and banking resources, what we might call the automated payment ecosystem. And so when we think about banking divide or the disparities in access to banking and credit resources, they still remain and they're pretty profound. When we look at age, there is a age disparity, but it's actually younger folks who have less access to banking. For credit, you can see we have very young or very old have lower access to credit. Along the income dimension, as one would expect, higher income, higher access to banking, as well as credit. Race and ethnicity, white households, higher access to banking, and for credit, there is a disparity. White and Asian households have higher access than other households. Overall, when we think about access to formal banking service and using and not relying on any informal banking service, we call that fully banked, and 67% of households overall are fully banked. 87% of households mostly use formal banking with perhaps occasional use of informal banking services like informal credit, like a payday loan or something like that. And then on the credit side, a little bit more than 80% of households have access to some credit cards, and things like that. When we think about digital divide, there are also some interesting disparities that are similar in a way to the credit and banking divide. When we look at smartphone ownership nationally, younger age predicts higher smartphone ownership. It shouldn't be super surprising. Along income, we have higher income folks have higher ownership. And then along race and ethnicity dimensions, there are some mixed results. The FDIC finds that African-American households are lower than average, with Asian households higher, but then a Pew study found that actually African-American and Hispanics are higher, like higher access to smartphone. And then the overall number for all households is about 73% from 2017 and been rising a bit. But I think this is often a lower number than people are expecting. I'll show numbers from transit riders that we did in the first part of this study. If we look at self-service and data plans, so one thing that we learned in our study on transit is that although people have smartphones, the quality of their data service and their cell phone plan varies quite drastically. From no data at all, they'll have a voice-only plan, which I don't think our research group knew existed, to an unlimited plans that we see that are much more expensive. For example, in this cell access, in terms of age, younger cell users are more likely than average to let their service lapse. And as we'd expect, low-income households are more likely, actually twice as likely as average, to let their service lapse. And finally, African-American and Hispanic cell owners are around twice as likely to let their service lapse compared to white cell users. And it was almost a quarter of cell users let their service lapse at some point during a month when they're waiting for their month to renew or they're using a prepaid service. Internet access at home is another dimension of this digital divide. FDIC, there's some mixed results along the age dimension with high access with the over 75% access along all age groups, but tapering off over 55. Although the Pew study found that higher access, and I have the resource list for these references at the end of the PowerPoint, so you can see the citations if you want to look at this data. The Pew study found that higher access for those over 50 for home internet, higher income, higher access, and then African-American households lower and Asian households higher than average, with the overall average being about 73% in the FDIC study and 90% in the Pew study have access to some form of broadband. One thing we learned is that many people are relying on their phones for their home internet service. So they're kind of considering that to be their universal internet access. And actually increasingly so, many are reducing their home internet through the broadband. So that's an interesting thing that we should consider when we're planning on relying on internet and smartphone for transportation service. Fare payment, trip reservation, trip planning. So our overall research questions from this project: what are the prevalence and types of automated fare systems in use in the US? How do the automated fare payment systems potentially exclude different riders? And we look at demographics, geography, where they live, the kind of technology they have access to, banking access, and other language and technology proficiency issues. Then we ask, what mitigation strategies have agencies adopted to include these potentially excluded riders, and how cost effective are they, and how really ridership effective are they? How many riders do they accommodate? And we look at those costs from an agency and a rider point of view. Now, these the first two questions I'm not going to address in this presentation. I'm going to focus on number 3 and 4. But very quickly, I can scan some of the results from this first two parts. And we did a lot of work in the field in our 3 case cities of Portland, Denver, and Eugene, the funders of the project. We did 2 focus groups in Portland and 1 in Eugene, and we did a larger sample survey of over 2,000 riders in the 3 cities. So very quickly, just running through that field work with the riders, and these are a little bit of the brief overview of the 3 cities, where just notably, the Lane County district is much smaller than the RTD in Denver and the Tri-County TriMet district in Oregon, which the latter 2 have around 2 million riders. 2 million in the population in the service district. I guess Oregon is a little bit less, whereas Eugene has only about 300,000. So we're expecting slightly different results there. We studied rider access to digital and financial resources, internet, smartphone, and their demographics, and some city-specific issues. Some overall conclusions: transit riders were similarly resourced to the general population, but still that means that there are some significant barriers to using emerging payment systems. For example, a significant number still rely heavily on paying cash on board. Most of that 30% appeared able to switch, but still a significant number claim that they had to rely on cash of some sort, and some claim that they could not ride at all if cash were completely eliminated. Smartphone ownership was high, over 85%, for all groups except for those over 55 that we counted as what were called boomers, baby boomers. A small but significant number were concerned about reaching monthly data limits. A significant number actually rely solely on Wi-Fi for their internet connectivity, meaning public available Wi-Fi on their phones or laptop that they bring to a cafe. So that was actually more than we were expecting. 7% of our sample had no access to formal banking systems or services. There was a general unease in our sample about storing credit information on websites or smartphones. Modeling revealed that access to credit cards and claimed comfort using automated payment systems like storing information on phones and websites predicted a lower reliance on cash on board payment. And so I think that's part of the key to this transition, is access to credit and understanding how to use automated payment systems. There were some important equity issues. Low-income respondents had lower access to smartphones, internet, and banking. Older respondents had significantly lower access to smartphones and internet. And some of those disparities differed a little bit city to city, which was interesting, meaning that we really would strongly encourage each city to do their own work on these, to understand these dimensions in order to develop workarounds and mitigations. So now let me proceed to what I want to talk about today. We wanted to understand the national practice in terms of what kind of workarounds were agencies going to deploy as they transitioned away from cash. So we had a survey that we did with, I think, around 100 agencies. We were asking, and I'm not going to go through these in detail, but what are you planning over the next 5 years in terms of reducing or eliminating cash? Have you evaluated the equity impacts of those decisions? And what mitigations or workarounds were you planning during this transition to accommodate folks potentially excluded from using the system? And then what are the costs associated with those mitigations? And what other things are they worried about? And so, unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of response. We only got 10 responses. So this is not a robust quantitative analysis, and I'm not going to even actually go into this very much. The most common response was that they were offering cash payment or fare loading at retail or agency partner offices. That was by far the most common. And in fact, one response was, what else is there? So as part of this study, we decided to add other variations like retaining some cash acceptance, for example, at onboard fare boxes on bus, not on light rail, because most light rail is proof of payment. And then some cash acceptance remaining at some ticket vending machines. So besides the cash at retail option, we wanted to look at just different variations of retaining cash in some of the fare box and ticket vending machines. And that was the variation that we saw in the responses to the survey. We were expecting other things, but it really relied heavily on the retail or agency offices for continued cash acceptance. So what we're moving forward with now is just looking at the costs and benefits of doing these things. And we created a spreadsheet model relying heavily on kind of a broad set of unit costs that we collected from national practice to inform this model. And we basically look at a base case where no cash is accepted, and we estimate the cost of collecting fare in that case. And we compare that to four scenarios. Adding a retail acceptance where the costs, of course, are adding the costs of funding that contract and paying for retail, that retail acceptance system and handling the cash. And then we have two partial cash acceptance scenarios: cash on board, fare payment, fare box on buses, not on ticket vending machines, and no retail. And then cash only at ticket vending machines and no retail, and no cash on fare on board. And then scenario 4, we decided, well, we should compare all of this to a full cash, like a base case, like a status quo, cash accepted everywhere. So we have a quantitative model and we have a qualitative model looking at some of the equity and disparities in some of these scenarios. For the quantitative model, we're looking at the costs of updating or retrofitting or providing new fare boxes or ticket vending machines with these cash or no cash capabilities. We kind of assume that the entire system is built out in year 1, and then we actually have 10 years of total capital and operating costs. Thinking that a 10-year lifespan would be roughly a lifespan of a fare collection system. And that's how we came up with this number. We look also in the case parameters of the total revenues collected, the ridership, and the share of riders that would be excluded or included with each scenario. So in the full cash acceptance scenario, we assume that the full ridership from today would be riding. And as cash is eliminated until the base case where there's no cash, we would assume more and more riders would be unable to ride. And we use our survey data to estimate that decline in ridership, but you might actually have to use other data or make expert estimates yourself if you don't have that data available. Our unit costs were collected from, again, a national survey of a few vendors and how they're providing for clients around the country. We looked at ticket vending machine and fare box costs. We looked at maintenance and capital replacement costs. We looked at smart card issuance and replacement costs and cash handling and different contracts for cash and other contingencies. We use a high unit cost and a low unit cost model to span some of the ranges that we gathered. And again, the model is for 10 years of capital and operating. Our qualitative side of this study of the model looked at what we thought of as barriers to use, kind of on a Likert scale, a very kind of, in this case, -2 we use as our most barrier, and then 0 is the no barrier, or the kind of a neutral case. So we looked at barriers in terms of personal costs of using these scenarios, spatial access to fare payment. So for example, well, I'll go into that a little bit more a little bit later. And then technological literacy and connectivity is another dimension of barriers. Sorry, I have a cat attempting to sit on the keyboard. Just take a moment. And so we break these barriers not only from the whole ridership standpoint, an overall barrier, but then we try to look at whether there'd be disparities in some of the demographic dimensions we were exploring, like race and ethnicity, age, income, or language proficiency. And so we kind of make judgments there based on our focus groups and some of our survey data. And the model creates kind of an equity score for each of the scenarios. So this is a little bit complex, and I'll just kind of run through this. We take all of the inputs, and the inputs are kind of case specific. So for example, we have the city specific ridership, number of stops, vehicles, all of those numbers we need to dimension out the model. We have our unit cost inputs that we collected, and the model, by the way, is available to use. It's at the site, it's available at the project website for you to download and play with. So we have all the unit costs that we collected. And then we have different assumptions around the revenue and cost profile over the 10-year period. For example, we assume that anything invested in year one, 10% of it has to be replaced each year as a kind of capital maintenance and replacement program due to wear and tear and vandalism and other issues. And I think this is pretty typical. Again, as I said, our ridership and our revenues are prorated down based on the cash acceptance. So that if cash is accepted less, we know that some riders won't ride. So we've prorated our ridership and revenues. We also assume the passenger revenues for the scenario remains the same over the 10 years, and that's important. It's probably not true, but it was the best estimate that we have. Each year, I believe each year, we release 1% of boardings as smart cards, assuming that's the number that's kind of issued and turned over. Oh no, and then 10% of the smart cards are replaced each year. And you can look in our model to see this. And then the cost of cash handling is proportional to cash. And then our scenarios. So we have our scenarios, our 4 scenarios. Once we have all these inputs, we create a year one initial capital deployment for the entire fare collection system on all vehicles and at all ticket vending machines in the entire system. And that includes smart card issuance, capital installation and training. Then years 2 to 10 are the annual capital replacement and the operating of that initial capital. So the operating costs of all of the system, which is not just capital replacement, it's also maintenance and operating. And then 10% of the year one smart cards are reissued, which in year one equated to 1% of annual boardings. Again, these were numbers that we just estimated based on different agencies that we looked at. The qualitative equity study, like I said, overall access rating, and then we have the disparities for each of the 4 scenarios. And we have the base scenario with no cash. So let me go into just quickly the unit costs. The unit cost sheet, again, I'm not meaning for you to dive into this right now, but you can see we have the low unit cost column here and the high unit cost, and we have the unit costs for different kinds of fare box. We have the installation costs. We have the different kind of ticket vending machines. Of course, for each, we need a cash collecting option and a non-cash collecting option because of our scenarios. We have the fare media for magnetic and then contact cards or contactless cards. And then the software, we've got our contracts for operating the systems. We've got marketing education. We've got our website and some other things, got testing and the contingency costs. So we talked to a lot of people who found that these were reasonable. We always felt that things could be adjusted. If you run the model yourself, you can adjust the unit costs or make a column or replace one of these columns with your own costs, and then just be sure to follow that through the model. It's just a simple spreadsheet model. For the annual costs, we had maintenance costs, a low and high of 5 and 6%. We had the annual replacement. These were the same, the replacement of the capital was the same cost as the initial capital. We didn't assume those changed. There was some contingency cost with the update of the capital. For the cash handling, for in the scenarios where we do have some cash, there is a cash handling as a share of the total cash collected. And then the retail contracts are 5 to 10% based on the cash that they collect. And I think those are fairly typical in the field. So our case parameters, this is just an example. These are the kind of numbers that you would need. We need a number of fare boxes, total number of fare boxes, total number of ticket vending machines, which is here. And we need a total passenger revenue. So we have an average fare collected per boarding. Here at the bottom, we have a total ridership on each of these systems. This is for the Portland example, Portland Gresham example. Your example would be different, obviously. So we have a average fare paid for all boardings is $1.41. That's important for us to know as we prorate down or up the number of riders who are potentially excluded. We don't make any assumption on, unfortunately, which system they're riding, nor on which fare system they would be using, whether it's a monthly pass or an adult full fare or a weekly pass, which obviously changes their average fare, but we just assume that they're paying the overall average fare per boarding, which is $1.41. So again, our 5 scenarios with this base, or the 4 scenarios plus the base has no cash anywhere. Our scenario 1 is we do add a retail cash workaround, this common workaround that we wanted to study mostly. And then we added these 2 variations where cash is collected on board in fare box on buses, not on light rail. And then here they're collected at ticket vending machines, mostly on light rail, but there might be some transit centers that have ticket vending machines that are where bus, light rail interact. And then we have full cash as our scenario 4. So one thing that's really important, it's really the heart of this model, is how many riders cannot ride under the different scenarios. We were lucky in that our phase 1 and 2 of the projects, we were able to study more than 2,000 riders, and we had a good idea based on the questions that we asked them, how many would not be able to ride. For example, in the no cash, the fully no cash base case here at the top, we knew that about 8% of riders could not ride based on our estimate of the questions around how people and how people were able to adapt to an automated fare system. Then we had other questions around how they would ride with different configurations of ticket vending machines and cash on board. So we got a sense that in this case, where we only had the retail workaround, we knew that that would add a few percent to the riders, but that a significant number still, about 5%, needed cash on fare box or ticket vending machines. And moving up, as we added cash on board buses, we added more riders still. And interestingly, cash at ticket vending machines, but not on bus, it didn't add as many riders in this Portland Gresham case as did cash on fare box. And then, of course, the full cash acceptance meant that we assumed that all riders that we recorded now would continue to ride. So some results. The total for the model is the total for the 10-year model. So it looks a little confusing. So if we look at the annual boardings, again, these annual boardings reflect what I just said, in that these reflect the number that we knew would not be able to ride. So if you look at the full model, we have here, let me move my little zoom thing. We've got the 77 million boardings per year. That is reduced as we reduce the cash acceptance down to 70 million. Again, this is that 8% reduction, or roughly, from what I just had in the previous slide. And then as we add cash acceptance, we're adding riders until we get to the full ridership. The total cost for collecting this fare over the 10 years is a low of $19 million, no cash accepted anywhere. These are those inexpensive fare boxes, those less expensive ticket vending machines. You have no cash handling costs, no retail contracts, nothing. And that's $19 million over 10 years. It's about 2.7 cents per boarding. It's extremely low. And the total fare collected is about $1 billion over the 10 years. And so you can see you spend $19 million to collect $1 billion worth of funding. It's quite revenue positive. On the other hand, if you add cash acceptance in these other 3 or 4 scenarios, you're adding more riders. You are adding the cost, adding cost to your fare collection system. Obviously, those systems are more expensive. So you go from 2.7 cents per boarding to 3.1 to 4.1 to 5.9 up to 7.7 cents per boarding. You're always only collecting $1.41 per boarding. But you can see that the additional ridership increases your fare collected, and you actually end up with more net fare collected as you offer more avenues for cash collection. You go from 980 million to a little bit more than 1 billion to I think the highest is the full fare collection. But this scenario 2, where you're collecting on fare boxes on board, you're very close to the full collection. Because as we saw, the number of riders able to ride under that fare box scenario was high, the highest actually among these not full cash collection scenarios. This is the low unit cost box here. The high unit cost has a similar relationship. I do believe, that the fares, the cost per boarding goes up from 5.5 cents up to 11 cents. And the net benefit is still quite is highest among this scenario 2, the cash on board, not at ticket vending machines. And it is closest to the full cash acceptance of the little bit more than $1 billion. But you can see the higher unit cost, you're spending more to collect fare in this column. Sorry, this row here, 19 million is nearly doubled to $38 million over 10 years. Another thing we do in the model is we ask, well, these are the total costs. This slide just went through this. What about the marginal cost of going from no cash collection and only if we look, we kind of focus on the cost, the incremental cost of adding the capability compared to the base case of no cash. And that also gives us slightly different results. Here we have, we would consider these incremental or marginal costs. So it looks higher. It's significantly higher when we look at just the cost of adding these riders that are accommodated, that were not accommodated in the base case, and then accommodated in these scenarios. So we have, for example, in this the scenario where we add the retail, it's about 13 cents per rider, which is, again, much less than the additional fare collected of $1.41, but it is significantly more than the average fare collection cost. On the other hand, if we look at the cost of adding the cash acceptance capability at fare box, we're looking at 28 cents per boarding per rider. And if we're looking at adding cash capability at just at ticket vending machines, it's 65 cents per boarding. Again, much less than the additional revenue, but here I think it'd be concerning that you are spending quite a lot of money to collect this fare. And a similar relationship exists for the high unit cost down here. And here you can see the, why is the ticket vending machine less? I do believe it must be a relationship with the ticket vending machine costs. But you can see that still 27 cents to 77 cents is a lot less than the fare collected. Now let's look at the equity assessment. I want to make sure I leave time for Q&A. So I said that we use this kind of Likert scale to rate these the different scenarios for their barriers to use, and then we looked at some disparities. We relied on survey data to understand some of these disparities. We looked at the difference in between groups, like for example, age, to kind of understand were there significant disparities in technological proficiency or access to smartphones or credit cards. And we use those disparities from the survey to give a kind of a Likert rating. That data won't be available to everyone. So you might want to convene an expert panel or something, or staff, to kind of get at some of these equity and disparity issues. And I see questions in the chat, so we'll get to those in a moment, sorry. So for example, our overall equity, or our overall kind of barrier access rating for personal costs was that, of course, scenario 4, which is the full cash acceptance, there wouldn't have been any barriers, because that is our, in essence, status quo or do nothing scenario. Our base case and the 3 scenarios where cash is limited, retail, fare box, and ticket vending machines, we did assume that there were some barriers due to personal costs because of the need to maintain a smartphone and cell plan and to use some of those automated systems, credit cards. We didn't, our ratings went all the way to -2, -1, or 0. It was kind of a 3-point scale. We really debated how high a resolution we could give this. And we went back and forth. We decided that three steps were kind of all that we felt comfortable with. You could develop one of your own. But again, it's a little bit coarse here. So then we looked at the data from the survey work, and we looked at, were the personal costs then, were there disparities within demographic groups or between demographic groups along this dimension of personal costs? There were mild disparities along race and ethnicity, differences between our riders of color and our white riders. And so but they weren't very strong. So we only decided that our base case, with no cash is collected anywhere, would have some mild equity issues here. On the other hand, our survey pointed to very strong disparities along the dimension of age and income. So here we decided we would use the -2 as the full disparity, or the worst disparity, strongest disparity, and then -1 for these medium systems, where the scenarios where there was some cash collected, and then a 0, of course, for a neutral status quo. And then similarly for the other 3 dimensions of barriers, this one was personal costs, the other was spatial access to purchase. So how convenient are these systems to use? For example, retail is not very convenient if you don't live near retail. And then technological literacy or connectivity. We looked at some of the access to internet and some of the questions around comfort using automated fare payment systems and cell phones. Okay, so these were some of the scores that were given. Again, if you use the model that you can download, you can change all these scores or not use this qualitative side at all. And then we average them. What's interesting is when we look at the average from the general barriers of use, those top rows, the scenario 2 came out slightly better than the other 4 cash reduced scenarios. Of course, our full scenario where we have all cash acceptance doesn't have disparities or barriers because they're assumed to be neutral as the status quo. The equity scores, the disparities, we did see that the base case was the worst, again, because of our assumptions. And then the other 3 were slightly better performing. If we look at the average overall, of course, our first scenario is the worst. One thing that we did find is that we made some assumptions around the spatial access, that fare boxes on board, because there are so many more on buses, you know, often many, many times more fare boxes than ticket vending machines or retail outlets, then that would enable there to be a little bit less disparity in the spatial disparity score. So that meant that scenario 2 was slightly more equitable, we felt, based on just our judgment, than the other 2 scenarios because of the spatial, slight improvement in spatial access. So our 3 case cities, I'll just wrap up with this. There's some interesting differences when you look at the 3 case cities. Denver is the largest with the most, the service area as being the largest ridership. And then Portland is slightly smaller than Eugene, as we showed, was about only 15% as large as the others. So there's some interesting disparities, differences between the cities that are interesting to consider when we think about these mitigations. If we look along the cost per boarding, we see similar between Denver and Portland, about 5 cents per boarding. And I think this is the high unit cost scenario, okay. But then when we look at Eugene, we find that it's significantly higher cost per boarding for the fare collection system. It's 25 cents, 26 cents per boarding. It drops a little, interestingly, because in their survey work, we showed that with the base case, they lost a lot of riders if they did not collect any cash. And they retain a lot of riders, they accommodate a lot of riders as they add these cash capabilities. And that meant that their fare collection costs per rider went down, actually, as they added these capabilities, at least for these 2. A ticket vending machine, actually, I guess it was quite expensive for them. And it, again, is probably the proportion of ticket vending machines per rider. There's a lot of dimensions here that are happening in the background of the model. But so we do see this general interesting difference between a smaller property and even Portland compared to Denver, which had the lowest fare collection costs per boarding. That also meant that from this standpoint of total cost, adding these equity or mitigations should be considered more strongly or more favorable because they are lower cost, because the number of riders supporting them is a lot. Whereas in the lower ridership property, these costs are quite high. They're spending nearly a third of, actually nearly a half of their fare collected in fare collection. And this kind of brings you to a third point, if you think about it, that smaller properties should strongly consider going fare free, not only in general, because they're spending a lot to collect their fare, but also as an equity workaround or equity mitigation of going cashless. Well, if you eliminate fare collection overall, then you've solved that problem as well. So yeah, there's just interesting, again, the relationship between the additional ridership accommodated and the differences in revenues between the different properties is just something to think about when you think about the agencies that you work with. I'm going to skip over the marginal costs and I'm going to skip over this equity. I'm just comparing the equity scores from the different properties. Again, these were, if you kind of squint your eyes, you can see that Denver had a little bit more equity issues than Portland Gresham, because in their survey work, again, the survey work we did with their transit riders, there were more disparities in terms of access to smartphones and some income-based disparities. And so those lowered the scores slightly for the equity scores for Denver compared to Portland. And again, these age, race, ethnicity, income, and language disparities, again, reflect the slightly different demographics of the different agencies. And so it was interesting to compare them. They weren't super different, but there were some differences based on the survey work. So I'm going to just wrap up. So some conclusions: larger properties spend less to collect fare. And that impacted the cost and benefit calculations for the workarounds for adding cache capabilities or retaining cache capabilities. Small properties spend a lot to collect fare and should consider perhaps even going fare free as an equity workaround, but in general. Retail is the lowest cost option for adding cache capabilities or retaining cache during this transition. It had by far the lowest cost per rider. Simple cache collection, so scenario 2, not change giving, but a simple validation on buses could be an important bridge. Those were not very expensive. Those were very low cost per accommodated rider in all cases. Ticket vending machines in general were much more expensive per accommodated rider in all cases. When larger numbers are excluded, like in Eugene, the equity mitigations are cheap because you're accommodating a larger group. So in Denver and Eugene, larger populations were potentially excluded, and adding retail only cost 14 cents per rider in Denver and 1.9 cents per rider in Eugene. So those were quite inexpensive. But again, these results depend strongly on the number of potentially excluded riders. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for discussion. I'm a little bit behind. Sorry about that.
Great. Thanks a lot, Aaron. That was wonderful. So yeah, you do have some time still
Okay.
to submit your question in the Q&A box.
Should I go through the Q&A myself?
I can read them to you, Aaron,
Okay.
and we'll just try and get through what we have so far quickly. So it is we have shared the project page. The final report was just published on there last week, and we uploaded the Excel spreadsheet for the modeling that Aaron went over. Are you sharing the survey instrument?
In the project final report, the survey instrument is in that appendix. Yes.
Great. There's a question about midway through on the cost revenue projections within the margin of error for the study, and how much should we be reading into whether one approach is better than the other?
Oh, that's a great question. We didn't consider a margin of error between our scenarios. For that reason, we use the high unit cost and the low unit cost to get a sense for a range, because we thought there might be some error introduced by relying only on one unit cost. But in terms of the moving from scenario to scenario, where you have a group of riders and then another group of riders, and we're making a kind of a declaration, as you're noting, that is the cost per boarding, there would be some error around that. It's a great point. But again, that error is related to changes in ridership. So one thing you might be wondering, we did this work, luckily to us, I guess, we did all the field work in the summer and fall of 2019. And as you know, 1 year later, ridership was quite different, which would completely change the numbers as I'm showing them, because our denominator would be quite different. So yeah, there's going to be error as the ridership changes. And that ridership, again, is what we estimated was based on our survey work, how many riders were excluded, how many would be riding under the different scenarios based on triangulating our survey questions. But there's going to be significant error in that. Yeah, so thanks for pointing that out. But we did not estimate what it might be.
And then we sort of, we have the whole issue of like how many people and what percent we're excluding. How does that specifically tie in with the unbanked and underbanked populations, and how is your study sort of address that group of riders?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in our survey, we kind of redundantly asked both about access to internet, smartphone, credit, and banking. We asked about comfort using the kind of automated fare payment systems like storing credit card information on a smartphone or on a website. And we also asked them how they pay and how they would pay if cash were eliminated. So we kind of covered both bases, and they don't often correspond because maybe someone claims they don't have access to credit, but then they claim that they will switch to credit if we were to eliminate cash. So that happens. But so we had both sources of information. We relied mostly on the latter, on people's declaration about how they would pay if cash were eliminated, to inform our model on the number that would be excluded. But if we didn't have that information, let's say you were to try to do this without our survey, you might rely only on unbanked data or the Pew survey or FDIC to try and estimate the number who might be excluded. The numbers weren't super different actually between the two data points, but we had the luxury of relying on our survey. But if you don't, then you could rely and attempt to make an expert estimate based on the Pew and FDIC research or other local research that you might be able to get.
Great. What about the difference between, let's say, buses and light rail, and how, buses are set up to take cash, most of them, and light rail have a lot of those machines out and available as people are waiting. So does that sort of affect the study?
Well, so the survey work we did with riders is, of course, on existing infrastructure. We interviewed them at bus stops and light rail stops. And all of that infrastructure is deployed, as you're noting. It has cash everywhere. On most systems, I don't know that there are many in the US that have eliminated cash. So those ticket vending machines, some of them may not accept, not every machine might accept cash, but there may be one available, or and again on Farebox on buses. But what the model is imagining is if on day one you were to completely reinstall your entire fare collection system with one of these 4 scenarios, or really 5 scenarios with the base case. And that is, you are purchasing new fare boxes, new ticket vending machines, and you're putting them out per the number of vehicles and light rail stops that you have in the system. And that is what the model is estimating. Those costs for a ticket vending machine with cash capabilities or one without are quite different. So the unit cost there is what we're modeling. And then what we do is we go 10 years of operating that new system that you've deployed on year one. For 10 years, you have the you have the capital replacement and maintenance, all that. And so that is the model. The study of the survey and the survey of existing riders was out in the real world where there is cash available. The model is assuming that you were to replace everything and on day one start operating with the new infrastructure.
All right, great. So as far as the future and going ahead, though, we are seeing how people are traveling, using multimodal. There's particularly the first and last mile tie-in with transit, whether it's light rail or bus. So we have the questions about, whether scenario 3, which I believe was the ticket vending machine, should get extra points as it accommodates the sort of multimodal options where people are having those on their phone to get,
I see what you're saying. So those could be at like mobility hubs that are more than just transit, that you could be loading fare or adding capability for a card or an account that also serves bike share, scooter share, transit. Yeah, that's a great point. It's actually not something that I had thought about. I hear what you're saying in terms of adding, making that look more favorable. I think that, our model is kind of focus on transit. And I think as an agency, if you're developing these mobility hubs, you'd want to take that into consideration. I don't know that it fits neatly into adding score within our model, but I think within a qualitative decision-making framework that should take into a lot more information than just our model, I think what the point that you've raised is important. That the fare box on board doesn't quite kind of address those different riders who may not even be using the transit part. They're coming to load their account for scooter share, or if they're using some kind of smart card or something. So your point is a great one. It's not something that we considered.
As far as let's take a look at like the study and say we've got these 3 different locations. Now, how do you see this applying to other locations or nationally? And I'm thinking we have a question touching on the different costs for each city, and then we have a question or we have a comment talking about a small regional area that rather than going for a free fare is getting a different sort of payment system that will bring down their costs. So I'm just trying to gauge if what sort of national scope we can apply.
I mean, with all of these models, I think they're as good as the inputs, right? So I do encourage anyone to download the Excel model. It is simple. It's got a few worksheets in there, a unit cost worksheet, the parameters where you estimate, you put in your number of ticket vending machines, and then you have to estimate the number of riders that are potentially lost from your different cash scenarios. That's probably the hardest part. And then the model runs from that. So you can manipulate most of the parameters of the model. And so I think nationally, you're going to have variation in ridership, obviously from property to property. But I would hope that our unit costs span from high to low fairly good. Again, the vendors that we talked to were national vendors. There aren't that many vendors of ticket vending machines. So if anything, the big costs that might change from property to property would be some of the contingency costs, depending on size. Ours are fairly broad. So I think that the model is set up to be flexible enough for a variety of contexts. And again, you can't break it. It's just Excel. Save a version, rename it, start editing it. If it starts not running right, you open the original. So, you can't really hurt anyone doing it. And you can, of course, totally revamp the unit costs, set some to 0 if they're not pertaining to you. And so I do urge people, and then email me if you have questions or getting funky results. We're always interested to see how people are using the model. So no, I think that there is no national model. I would agree. And I think models like this are best when they're tailored for each situation.
And then I guess I'll just wrap up with another question about, tying in maybe, I don't know, you could talk about sort of the reception or working with the transit agencies, and in particular, how they view the change in their ridership based on different models or scenarios.
Yeah, so we have the agencies that funded the study are on our technical advisory committee, and they've been excited about some of the survey work, and they're now at the end of the study getting the model. And so we haven't actually gotten feedback on them using the model, but we got feedback that the model addresses a lot of the issues that they were interested in. They were excited about how it connects to different things that they were asking and worried about. So I think that we don't have a long track record yet of getting feedback from agencies that have used it. But please, if you're out there and you're wanting to use the model, we're interested to see how it works. But we got good feedback in terms of how it was at least set up and designed. And we did have sessions where we presented to them, got feedback. We have got a lot of feedback on the unit costs from the agencies that we engaged with and consultants. And so we are fairly not certain on the unit cost, but we know that they're within a range that agencies that we talk to are comfortable with. And so, yeah, we're waiting for that feedback in terms of how it could be used in real life to actually possibly plan long-term fair system replacement. So please reach out to us if you do end up using it, please.
Well, yeah, thanks so much, Aaron. This has been great. Do you have any like parting comments? Anything we left out you want to touch on?
No, I just think that the final report at the website has a lot of detail that I kind of obviously scanned through. So if you look at the final report along with the Excel model, I think you'll get a better sense for how to use it, and some of the debates we had around how do you estimate some of these things from triangulating from our survey work or from national data, some of the questions that came up. So
Great. Yeah. So we encourage you to check that out. Check out our upcoming webinars. We also have our past webinars, the recordings and slides up. All of that's available through the NITC website. So yeah, thank you for joining us and hope to get your feedback from our survey. Thank you.
thanks, everyone.